As Venezuela enters a new phase of turmoil, questions about leadership and legality are coming into sharp focus. Opposition figure Maria Corina Machado, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate who remains in hiding after the disputed 2024 presidential election, is a voice for democratic change. However, she is being excluded from the current transition plan. Here at home, many legal experts are critical of the U.S. military action that led to Maduro's capture and his federal arraignment in Manhattan on drug trafficking and related charges. The unprecedented case is a departure from traditional international law and executive authority. We're also watching how these events intersect with questions about the legal status of Venezuelans living in the U.S., including visa policy, immigration status, and what federal court rulings might mean for families right here in South Florida. From the legal status of Venezuelan immigrants here to the federal case unfolding with Maduro, we are joined by legal experts Tara Newsom, attorney and legal professor, and also immigration attorney Paul Palacios with Migrants Foundation, Inc. Thank you so much for joining us. Tara, I'd like to start with you. As we speak, the U.S. Senate has just voted on the War Powers Act resolution, 52-47, with 5 Republicans breaking ranks and voting in favor of this. Of course, it does have to go to another vote in order for final passage. Why is this relevant, and how do you see this affecting the questions about the legality of this extraction?
I think this goes to the framework of how we should be viewing all of this, and that's through the lens of the United States Constitution. And so the 7 articles of the United States Constitution grant the powers, right? The Article 1 is to the legislative branch that has the power to declare war, engage in war. They also have the power of the purse. In the 1970s, they gave themselves the War Powers Act, which allows them to check the president's Article 2 power to be commander-in-chief and the chief head of state and all of that. So what we're seeing in real time is Congress actually responding to the president's, mighty power of trying to have this inherent power that isn't actually constitutional law. It's sort of an interpretation of it, to utilize the executive power to go into a country and what looked like a real conflict between whether it's an extraction to bring back for indictment, or is it a regime change? And so we're seeing Congress really giving a report card to the sitting president. Hey, we don't necessarily buy that this is just trying to take Maduro out, bring him back to make sure that we can indict him and have federal law. It really looks like they're listening to the rhetoric that he's posting and saying in real time that he wants a regime change. And that's the job of Congress, to check the president. But you've really got to look through this through the lens of both international law and domestic law. From an international perspective, this has only been precedented a few times, especially from the United States. International law really dictates that a regime change cannot happen unless 3 things happen. You can't interfere with a country's sovereignty unless, number 1, the country invites you to, number 2, it's self-defense, or number 3, you have the United Nations Security Council give you permission. None of that existed here.
What about domestically?
Domestically, the DEA, the FBI have all been empowered by Congress to go ahead and support arrest warrants and indictments, and to use military support to do so. But this is where the conflict really is at, and why it's so important that Congress is speaking right now. And that's because you have our Secretary of State Rubio saying this is just an execution of a domestic law to extract and bring to justice here in the courts, just like we did with the Panama President Manuel Noriega in 1989. And then you have the president and his other top advisors saying, no, this is a regime change. We're going to control Venezuela. And so the courts are really going to have to unwind what is the predominant purpose from this administration. Is the predominant purpose to execute a lawful extradition, or is it a regime change? And I think the report card right now is saying they don't believe the president.
Well, let's pivot to the federal drug trafficking case, right? That Maduro has already pleaded not guilty, as did his wife, Celia Flores. Legally speaking, is he going to be tried as an American? How does this work?
Well, part of our domestic law is somewhat international. He could, and he is, offering that he is the head of state. He is the lawful head of state of Venezuela. And so that would offer him the head of state of immunity. Of course, that requires him to have recognized from the United States as the head of state. And in August of last year, the United States Secretary of State did not recognize him, recognized his opposition, Edmundo Gonzalez, and so that doesn't look like it's going to be very weighty. But what he will now be is under the jurisdiction of the federal courts. And what we saw is that he pled not guilty, but when he did that, he also said, I am the head of Venezuela, and I am the first lady, said his wife. All the narrative of trying to execute that defense of being head of state.
However, I think that the Trump administration, the prosecution might run into a little bit of trouble here because the Trump administration conceded that his VP, Delcy Rodriguez, is in charge of Venezuela. She was elected in the same election as Maduro. And so is he saying that she is a legitimate vice president to take charge in Venezuela?
And
that
Paul,
would legitimize Maduro.
Paul makes a great point, but the federal court has to actually get to that point. And because the precedent of Manuel Noriega before showed that the court never bought that case, that he was the head of the state. Of course, it was different. It was a military coup. He was never recognized by the United States, but it's the same kind of defense. So I think you're 100% right. But now that he's in front of the federal courts, it's likely that they set that aside and they look at him and the superseding indictment that's before them, which is an extension of the 2020 indictment. And so these narco-terrorism, cocaine conspiracy, weaponizing cocaine to get at the American people, this is all lawful part of an indictment that if that was the action of the United States to actually execute that arrest warrant is legal. Now, you have to remember, too, though, the president is also flexing this something called the inherent power of the executive branch that was tried under George H.W. Bush, and it was actually introduced by Bill Barr, who was Trump's old attorney general. That's never been really recognized as settled constitutional law, that the president has this inherent power to bring somebody into the country, and if a regime change is part of that, that's okay. But it's not likely that the courts are going to pay attention to any of that. They're going to look at those superseding indictment, those narco-terrorism charges, and because it's an extension of 2020, and we've already started to go through the trials of other people that have been brought into the case, that this will move forward. And in March, we'll see pretrial motions, we'll see plea negotiations, and possibly a trial. And if it ends up like Noriega, that he ended up dying in prison in 2017, and that might be Maduro's fate as well.
Paul, you brought up an interesting point about the election, the fact that in 2024, during the presidential election, the Carter Center was there on the ground observing the election, and the Carter Center said that this was not a democratic election. Right. The United Nations had a team ready to go to observe. They were uninvited, so they were not able to certify that. Secretary of State for the Biden administration, Tony Blinken, said that this was not a democratic process. So there are formal organizations, international observers who have said this was not a democratic election. You've just brought the point up that it could be a problem for the Trump administration to recognize Delcy Rodriguez, who was elected in that same election.
In that same election that has been shown to be fraudulent, and it's been shown that Edmundo and Maria Corina Machado gained about 70% of the vote. And there are, I don't know how many countries around the world, including the European Union, that do not recognize Maduro as the elected president of Venezuela because of that fraudulent election. And so the Trump administration went and extracted Maduro, claiming he's not a legitimate president, he's a fugitive from the law, but then installed Delcy Rodriguez as the VP. He turned to Marco Rubio, President Trump, and said, I believe Delcy Rodriguez is being sworn in right now. Well, she is the one that was on the ballot with Maduro when the fraudulent election occurred, so she should not be regarded as the elected VP of the country either.
It's a weakness in their argument.
The Trump administration now claims that the United States, are the ones controlling Venezuela. But that doesn't mean that we left anybody in Venezuela to control Venezuela directly. There are no Americans in Venezuela, unless perhaps the CIA is there behind the scenes, which has been claimed. But the Maduro regime, without Maduro, is still in control of Venezuela.
There are so many Venezuelans who live in the Tampa Bay area, who live in the state of Florida, who are concerned about their immigration status. There are visas, there are paroles. We've talked about the temporary protected status. What happens to them?
Well, so far, none of that has changed. The Parole for Venezuelans program, along with the Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians, that was eliminated by the Trump administration, and that's not it's not affected by this process. What would be affected, perhaps, is the asylum applicants, Venezuelan asylum applicants in the U.S. People are claiming, well, we took out Maduro, now you can go back to your country, and that is just not the case. Because as I said, we have left the same regime in power. So people who have been persecuted by the Maduro regime will be persecuted by the Delcy Rodriguez regime, by the Diosdado Cabello regime, and by the Vladimir Padrino regime even more. Because now there has been a military action against Venezuela, and anybody that they deem a traitor to the country will be arrested, perhaps persecuted and tortured.
So for the folks who are watching this and aren't really sure, not familiar with the temporary protected status that was eliminated by the Trump administration for Venezuelans, can you describe the impact of that change?
Well, the temporary protected status was extended in the waning days of the Biden administration. The Trump administration came in and vacated that extension instead of following the statute as it should be to wind down the temporary protected status, but because they would have had to waited the 16 months or the 18 months that they would be in process. So that litigation is still ongoing. The order putting back the temporary protected status for Venezuelans has been stayed, though. So right now, nobody has temporary protected status, and it won't be approved for extension. It is possible that the court may rule in favor of the Venezuelan, but by that time, the temporary protected status would have expired anyway.
As an immigration attorney, as a fellow Venezuelan, what advice are you giving Venezuelans who are calling your office for information, for legal advice?
Well, for legal advice, if they are petitioning for asylum, if they have not petitioned for asylum, and they are concerned and they can petition for asylum, they should do so. And they should seek legal advice, because it is possible that the government in their asylum proceedings might seek to dismiss their asylum proceedings, saying, well, we took out Maduro, so now you can go back to your country. But we have to show them that, in effect, that has no effect. In reality, fear of future persecution is higher now than it was before. Now that the American government has taken action against Venezuela, and the Maduro regime is still in power, even though he's not there.
And real quickly, in the short time we have left, I just want to ask this question because so many people have sent me questions asking, can we travel to Venezuela to check on friends or relatives? And the answer is?
Well, the answer is, I'm not sure whether we can or not. If you are a Venezuelan American, you have to enter Venezuela with your Venezuelan passport anyway, and they're not going to deny you entry probably. But as a Venezuelan American, I would be very leery of going to Venezuela. It's probably a perilous time to go there. They could accuse you of being a traitor to the country, and they can do that. They have a new law that allows them to do that without much due process, and you could be jailed. And so I would advise against it for now until we see some resolution to the change in the regime.
Tar, and the State Department has not changed its stance on advising that Americans, no one travel to Venezuela.
No. But I mean, I think clearly in front of the Congress right now, this is a time to really be safe and be smart and let this play out a little bit to make sure that anyone that wants to travel back home is safe and sound.
Thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your opinions and your expertise with us. Again, our thanks to Tar Newsom and also Paul Palacios for coming in and joining us.